That is probably just
Welcome once again to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast for anyone who is as confused by the latest health study as I am by trying to read an analog clock. Did you guys grow up in the era of reading analog clocks?
Yeah.
As did I, and I can't do it.
Seriously?
I have completely lost the ability, and they barely teach it in schools anymore. Chris is now reading his watch.
How's your penmanship?
Oh, awful? Do you know what? It's awful.
I have an iWatch which has an analog version.
You do, and you can read it?
Yeah.
It takes me forever.
It's 440.
My penmanship was terrible. It was always a source of tension in my household when I would come home with my terrible penmanship grades. My daughter inherited my terrible penmanship, and she goes to school and they say, people type now. Nobody uses penmanship.
It's so true.
Maybe she's destined to be a doctor.
I'm so happy for her. That's all I can say. Anyway, for those of you who don't know, I am Matt Fox, professor of epidemiology and global health here with Chris Gill.
Hello.
And Don Thea.
Hi, yep.
In the Department of Global Health.
What do you think about spelling?
Oh, also terrible at it.
Like ichthyosis. I mean, does this matter that we can spell that or not anymore?
No, because spell checker will sort that out for you and change it to something else.
Right.
So... Anyway,
ickiness.
Anyway, we are here as usual in the Boston University Godly Studio. So, guys, now that summer is over, have you guys probably don't have to do nearly as much back-to-school shopping as I do? You guys do a lot of back-to-school shopping?
You know, I did, but thank God that's over because now I'm back to my one true passion in life, the only thing that satisfies me, which is spending my hours, all waking hours, on the Population Health Exchange website, which I do now 14 hours a day.
Wow, because, see, I was going to recommend
stopped sleeping.
I was going to recommend a great website for back-to-school shopping.
It's amazing.
Which is the Population Health Exchange
There's
website.
so much you can learn on that website,
You
Matt.
can get
you would be surprised.
all your back-to-school things that you need, like there are classes on there you can sign up for.
There are photographs of incredibly handsome professors.
But you can't get number 2 pencils.
Can we work on that? Is there a way to get those up there? We'll get some
and
up
protractors.
there.
I want to be able to get protractors.
Mm-hmm. And
compasses.
What else do you get at back to school? I don't know. You can't get your back to school clothing. That's
Colored
for sure.
pens.
Unless we have Population Health Exchange sweatshirts and T-shirts. We need a
Folios?
line of clothing.
Folios, mugs.
We need a line of clothing.
We got mugs. How about little shooter shots? No, public health. We don't do that. Sorry.
Oh, Chris had to go there. So anyway,
Moving on.
This is the Boston University School of Public Health resource hub for lifelong learning. You should really check it out at www.pophealthex.org. And as a reminder, if you could all go out and give us a rating on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or whatever it is that you use. And in particular, we were hoping that people could let us know if any of you out there are listening, use this podcast in courses that you teach in any way. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to know what it is you're using the podcast for, or if you use it in some other creative way that we would be interested in knowing about. It'd be great to hear from you.
Maybe people are using it as sort of a whisper podcast, the kind of podcast people listen to and go to sleep at
So
night.
I'd be curious to know that, actually. How many people listen to the podcast? Because I listen to podcasts every night as I go to sleep, and I find so we have a rule I have a rule in our house, which is you cannot put on anything to go to sleep to that is interesting, because then I stay awake. So it's got to be, something short segments, not very interesting, and I'm out.
You should try melatonin.
Really? Tell me more about melatonin.
I will in a minute.
Because that's interesting, because today, let's move on to the show. In our first segment, which is our Journal Club segment, we are going to talk about a study of the effect of melatonin on sleep. What a coincidence that you raised that, Don. Then in our second part of the podcast, which is our deep dive segment, we are going to talk about a paper which critiques the field of nutritional epidemiology and has gotten a lot of press, and something that we know Chris loves to talk about.
I'm hungry for this one.
Oh. Let's just pause to acknowledge how bad that was.
I was thinking we could, in lieu of ratings, we could like issue a challenge. We could do I have it here, the 5-star, the 5-star
You can't read his handwriting.
The 5-star review haiku big challenge contest is the best of fun, and that is actually a haiku.
So
Can you make that into an acronym?
Okay.
And you should give us a 5-star rating. That's the point of the haiku.
So
but you have to write your rating as a haiku
So everyone who gives us a rating
in
should,
haiku form.
what do they
gives
get?
us-
What do we give them? What can we give anyone who would write a haiku as a
Review.
on iTunes?
A shout out at the next podcast.
Number 2 pencils. We don't have like a mug we could give them, or a
could-
all right, a mug.
We could personalize it by pre-nibbling them.
We will.
What?
I think I
Let's
don't
not go
want to
there.
do that.
Nope.
I don't want to do that.
Infectious disease
We'll give
risk.
you a
Yeah,
mug.
good
If
point.
anyone, the first person who writes a haiku on iTunes, we will send you a mug that Chris has not used.
Chris, I think it's time for you to wait in the car.
Okay.
Okay, so now on to the show. Oh, wait, I didn't even say, and then we have our third segment, which is our Amazing Amusing, in which we will get on
Wild
to
and wacky,
some
isn't
of
it?
the things that make us laugh, or we will find something that Chris will decide is a topic that is not good enough, and then he'll switch topics in the middle. Anyway, so let's get into our segment 1, which we are going to get into an article that looks at the effect of melatonin on sleep in people with something called delayed sleep-wake phase disorder. It was published in PLOS Medicine, which is a journal I quite enjoy. The first author was Tracy Sletton of Monash Institute of Cognitive and Clinical Neurosciences in Victoria, Australia. And the study was entitled Efficacy of Melatonin with Behavioral Sleep-Wake Scheduling for Delayed Sleep-Wake Phase Disorder, a double-blind randomized clinical trial. A lot of words in there.
Jeez.
All the words. All the best words.
Best.
Now, unlike most of our other studies, we did not pick this one because it got a lot of headlines. We picked it because, quite frankly, we travel a lot and we wanted to know whether or not melatonin was going to help us sleep. This study actually doesn't seek to answer that question. This isn't about people who are taking melatonin to deal with jet lag. It's specifically about melatonin for people with a particular condition called delayed sleep-wake phase disorder. But because of that...
Which is not the same thing as insomnia.
Right.
It's a subset of insomnia.
It's a kind of insomnia.
A kind of insomnia. But because of that, I don't have any headlines for you. This one, I won't say generated a ton of headlines. Don, let's start with you giving us the rundown on hitting the high points on what they did here.
Oh, boy.
And I will...
Oh, boy.
Something it had. I think some part
All
of the
right.
protocol had to do with the creation of a very large number of acronyms.
Yeah, that was one of the things we probably can talk about. But I think this paper wins the prize for the most number of opaque
If
acronyms.
there was an award for non-standard acronyms, I would nominate this paper for
It is
sure.
hyper acrimonious, hyper
Acronym-
acronomious.
Acronymous.
Anyway,
All right. We ready?
I'm sure we are.
Okay, so as Chris said, there are several types of insomnia. These researchers were focused on one subset of a particular kind of insomnia, and that kind of insomnia is insomnia that is associated with a disruption in the internal regulation of melatonin, which is a hormone produced by the pineal gland in the brain and is pretty intimately associated with sleepfulness and wakefulness. And so there's a group of people out there who have a disorder in the secretion of this hormone, melatonin, which produces what they call phase shift, which is essentially that you are a night owl. You don't go to sleep at the normal time. So you go to bed late, you get to sleep late, you wake up late, and for a lot of people, this can be problematic because
debilitating, I would
it's
think.
debilitating. Yeah, because they're falling asleep and they're not productive, and it has all sorts. I mean, we all have been there to a certain extent. When you can't get enough sleep, you feel like crap the next day. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to find out whether melatonin works for this particular situation where there is an endogenous disruption of melatonin physiology, in essence, and that's not the same as Chris referred to, other kinds of insomnia, and one of the other kinds that they refer to is homeostatic sleep drive disturbance. That's not this, and I don't know what that is,
Okay.
but that's not this.
Can you repeat that? Homeostatic sleep drive disturbance?
Yeah.
H?
Yeah, so it's somehow
D.
it's
You're trying to
independent.
create another acronym?
It's independent of melanoma. Yeah, maybe that's a haiku.
It could be.
All right. So in any event,
it's an OUA.
So what these authors tried to do is they tried to identify a population of these people by advertising and getting people in, and then they put them through a series of physiologic tests to establish whether, in fact, they were a member of this group or not. And the focus of this research project is only on those individuals. And the way they determined whether those individuals were a member of this group is that when they brought them to the research site, there was a baseline period when they observed when they went to bed, when they went to sleep, and when they woke up. And they also determined whether this melatonin disruption occurs by bringing them in to the laboratory, and they set them in the laboratory for 6 hours, and they dimmed the lights, and they couldn't do any kind of activities. They couldn't have had any kind of coffee. And then they collected saliva every hours until 2 hours after their anticipated bedtime. And they measured the amount of melatonin, and they found that in the people with this syndrome, the melatonin did not get secreted as you would imagine, around the time of bedtime. And that was the circadian disruption in these individuals.
This is the delay, the sort of the biological basis of the delay in onset of sleep.
It's an abnormality in melatonin secretion at the appropriate time.
Right.
So once they identified these people who were all night owls, so the average time that they would get in bed and go to sleep is between midnight and 2 a.m. And they asked them, what would be the optimal time for you to go to bed? And based on the fact that they had jobs and they had things that they had to do, they all said basically 10:30 in the evening. That was their desired bedtime, which is the DBT. Right.
It was 10:30?
I think it was 10:30, 10:20. And so what they did is they then, for the subsequent 4 weeks, they said to these people, okay, we want you to try to go to bed at 10:30. We want you to try to get into bed at 10:30 for 5 out of the 7 days each week for the next 4 weeks. And they then randomized it to 2 groups, double-blind, randomized. And in the control group, they simply tried to follow those instructions to see if they could phase shift back to a normal sleep-wake cycle, i.e., they tried to get into bed at 10:30 and fall asleep and wake up at a normal time. And that was the placebo group. So that's really all they got.
They got a placebo pill.
And they got a placebo pill.
Yeah.
Right. And then the intervention group was, they got the same thing, except that the pill contained 5 milligrams of melatonin, which they took 1 hour before their desired bedtime. And then what they did is they put a Fitbit on these people, and they had them keep a diary.
Not actually a Fitbit, but like a
Fitbit-like
right?
device.
Actigraphy.
Yeah.
An
So basically
Actigraph.
what it did was measure motion. And by looking over time at the motion that these people exhibited, they could infer when, in fact, sleep occurred. You know, there's a little bit of tossing and turning, but then you settle in and you sort of fall asleep. And so what they did was they then determined the outcomes. And there were a whole bunch of different outcomes that they had, a whole bunch of various scales, which they didn't call Z-scores, but I think could probably be termed Z-scores.
Oh, that's very funny.
Yeah, how about that?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I did not get it. I'm looking at you going, these aren't Z-scores. What are you talking about? That was a joke. That was a joke.
Scores, yes.
So anyway, the main outcome was the advanced time in sleep onset. So was their sleep onset actually able to be changed from 2 a.m. or 1 a.m. to 10:30 p.m.?
Sleep onset or bedtime?
Sleep onset.
Bedtime and sleep onset. They measured both. They measured when did they successfully, on a consistent basis, get into bed, and then when did they fall asleep. And obviously, it wasn't the same instant. One would have to precede the other, usually.
Almost always. But the primary outcome was
it advanced time for sleep onset?
Right. How long it took them to actually fall asleep.
Right.
Based on either on self-report with the diary or by this
Fitbit.
Actigraph widget that showed that they were
But if I can just be clear here,
motionless or something, sleeping.
sleep onset time is not a measure of a change in time. It's the actual hour,
Right.
the clock time.
Right. So what they wanted to look is the delay from getting into bed to when you successfully fall asleep.
As well as
Sleep
when
onset
you
time-
got into bed.
Sleep onset time is simply the hour clock time
Right.
that
Right,
you
right,
went
right,
right.
to bed.
Right.
Is it 2 a.m. or is it 10:30 p.m.?
Right.
Right.
It's not a change in that time.
But in their analysis, they looked at a change in the sleep onset time.
That I agree with you.
Yeah.
It's TIB.
Right.
Time in bed.
Time in bed,
Right.
SOT, sleep onset time.
And then they also looked at sleep efficiency, which I had to look up. I had no
Total
idea
sleep time.
what sleep efficiency is. And that's really the amount of time that you spend in bed as a denominator and the amount of time that you are spending in bed that you're actually asleep, which is the numerator.
Right. And then we've got the sleep onset latency time, the sleep efficiency time, the total sleep time, and the wake after sleep onset time.
Wazo.
The WASO score.
Right. And then they did a whole
Wazo.
then they administered a whole bunch of scales to determine what is the effect on your productivity and your feeling of well-being, and then they had a clinician evaluate what their assessment was of what are the knock-on effects of this phase shift in their sleeping. The inclusion criteria were individuals 16 to 65 years of age that had to have a daytime commitment, so they couldn't be somebody whose lifestyle is simply sitting on the couch and playing World of Warcraft.
Or tanks.
Or tanks, or something like that. So for 5 days,
or
Or
college student
night
who's
security,
got
night security guard.
classes a couple of times.
Right. So they got to have something that's sort of a regular schedule the next day. They excluded people who were using drugs, who were smoking, who had moderate to high caffeine or alcohol use, who had a job that had a night shift, who had traveled across 2 time zones in the last 2 months. So things that would mess up your circadian rhythms. So they got down to 116 individuals, which was less than their stated sample size, we might add, who were randomized, 62 males and the mean age of 29. And so really, they were in comparison to the baseline, both groups showed improvement in time in bed, hour in bed, as well as sleep latency. But the group that received melatonin had a greater effect than the placebo group. So they both improved, but the melatonin group improved more than the placebo group. And again, the placebo group were
How much more?
were given a structured set of instructions that they should attempt to go to bed earlier. So they brought their mother in, I think, and said, "You got to get to bed earlier."
Looks like their sleep onset time latency improved by 29 minutes.
The sleep onset time, not the sleep onset latency.
The decrease in the amount of time they lay there tossing and turning trying to get to sleep, they went to sleep 29 minutes earlier in the melatonin group.
Where are you getting 29?
I'm getting this
I see
from
34.
table 3.
Table 3 is, go to table 2. Table 2 is the
That's the one
sleep
where it says 34
parameters
minutes.
and the baseline. Yeah, it's 34, 34 minutes.
So
But
half
hang
an
on.
hour.
Hang on. But to be clear, that's the difference in time of going to bed. Falling asleep.
Right.
So that's not a measure of tossing and turning time. That is simply a measure of, did you fall asleep at an earlier time than you used to, which is a function of also what time you went
got
to
into
bed.
bed. Right.
Which did change
Yes.
as well.
But the true sleep onset latency shaved off. Like if you control for all of that time they went to bed, the melatonin people went to sleep, fell asleep on average 12 minutes earlier.
Right.
Bottom line.
It took them 12 minutes less to
Less
fall
time.
asleep.
Right.
Yes.
Right. 2 more pages of the Reader's Digest.
And that's it. And that is not, but that is not their primary outcome. And I think that's one of the issues that I had with this study, which is that there are page after page, well, not page after page, but there's pages of outcomes here. And we know that when you have lots of outcomes, you're more likely to find false positives because there's so many of them. Now, they've done nothing deceptive or devious here. We've got all the outcomes, so it's not a critique. And they picked a primary outcome, and their primary outcome was, in fact, showed a benefit in terms of 34 minutes. My issue was that I was not convinced that the primary outcome of sleep onset time was the right measure. Now, I'm not a sleep researcher. I fully acknowledge that. And I will say I was more convinced that it was a problem before Don and I chatted about this, in which I sort of start to get why they want to know about sleep onset time. It's because, this is essentially part of the reason they're not going to sleep until later is because there's something going on biologically. They're not producing the hormone. And so they can't fall asleep at earlier times, and this may be helping them. So, okay, so I get that. But still, it seems to me the tossing and turning time also matters. How long does it take you from the time you get in bed until you fall asleep? And there was a benefit, statistically significant if you care about that, but the difference was 12 minutes.
Which seems awfully small potatoes.
It seems
as a bottom line.
small. It's not nothing. I'm not trying to say it's nothing, but it seems small.
Right, but if we're talking about people whose daytime lives are crippled in some way because of this disorder, a difference in 12 minutes seems implausibly short to actually have a measurable impact on why you feel sleepy all day long during the day.
Yeah.
And then why you could not get to bed until 2 in the morning.
And we're not sleep physiologists, and it
Right.
is a very complex
that.
issue because it's not just a matter of the elapsed time. It's not just a matter of how late. It's really a matter of the quality of the sleep. And then they looked at sleep efficiency, which is how often are you tossing and turning versus how often are you still. But still, there's all sorts of other levels of sleep that confer restfulness when you wake up. So it's it's an area that we don't claim expertise in.
No. And as I said, that's part of why I think I backed off on my criticism of the choice of primary endpoint, because I can see some logic in why you'd want to use it. I just don't think it just doesn't strike me as, it seems to me that what actually happened was both groups, their time of getting into bed got earlier, right? As you'd expect, because they set this. And in both groups, their time of falling asleep got earlier. So it seems to me there was a much bigger effect of just getting into bed earlier than there was on actual time from getting into bed to falling asleep. Mm-hmm. In particular, what concerned me was, if you look at SOL, which is
not the other thing.
Sleep onset latency.
Stands for something else.
Sleep onset latency. So the amount of time from getting into bed to falling asleep. They've got the baseline measure in the placebo group and the melatonin group, and then they've got the on treatment nights in the placebo group and the melatonin group. The sleep onset latency is about 21 minutes in both groups on average at baseline. It goes up in both groups. Mm-hmm. It goes up in the melatonin group and the placebo group. It just goes up a lot more in the placebo group. It goes up by about 15 minutes in the placebo group and 5 minutes in the melatonin group. What explains why it's getting worse in both groups and getting
especially in the placebo
preferentially
group.
Worse in the placebo group? I mean, it could be just sort of chance, and you entered into the study at a time of, this is sort of regression towards the mean, regression back to poor sleeping behaviors.
Or something to do with the change in the bedtime that had been imposed by the study protocol. I mean, there's a compensatory... I don't know.
Well, maybe no. In fact, maybe that is the answer. Maybe it's that by going to bed earlier, their sleep onset latency is going to be longer because it wasn't the time that they were actually normally going to be tired. So fair enough. Maybe that explains it. Mm-hmm. And so, but why does it get worse from baseline? I guess that's it. No, I guess I take it back. That makes sense. That makes sense to me. Maybe that is the reason. Maybe it's that because you're shifting the bedtime back, you are making it harder to sleep. So you would expect that to go up, but you're reducing it in the melatonin. My point here is, in terms of sleep onset latency, things aren't getting better. But relative to what might happen if you shift your bedtime, maybe it does. Mm-hmm. So
because you're habituated to a later bedtime, so you're just sort of forcing the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe that's some evidence. Any other issues?
Yeah, I had another issue.
Go ahead.
Two issues, actually. They claim that they obtained melatonin from a manufacturer, which I looked up.
Where?
Where?
Where's the manufacturer? Did you notice?
In Australia?
No, it's not in Australia. It's right here in Sudbury, Massachusetts.
That's right.
Really?
Yeah, it is.
Right down the road.
Yeah.
Sleepy Sudbury.
We can go
visit to his name.
So in any event,
what's their mascot?
It's the Dormouse.
Go ahead, Don.
So in any event, they make a big deal out of the fact that they've reached out to a manufacturer that guaranteed the purity of it. And I went to the website and looked at this manufacturer's website, and they claim that they create these substances, and melatonin is one of a whole bunch of dietary supplements that are highly purified, and they explain how important it is that it be highly purified, but they provide no information. And, I think it's a really, really important issue that we need to know whether, in fact, melatonin in the dosage that were given to these people was quality controlled, because these dietary supplements, in particular melatonin, and they actually refer to it in the discussion section that we need to be careful because the pills that are bought in these in supplement stores is notoriously variable in terms of the amount of melatonin that's
Or
in
even
it.
just at CVS when you get the
Or even
melatonin
CVS,
pills.
yeah.
Who knows what it is?
It's not a drug, so it's not subject to good pharmaceutical manufacturing practices. So I don't feel confident that I know how much melatonin were in these pills that were administered by these people. And as a corollary, it makes me uncomfortable if people are to infer from the results of this study that melatonin is in fact a good thing for them, and they go to GMC or CVS and they take melatonin off the shelf. They have no idea how much melatonin is in there.
Are you worried
It's highly
Are
unregulated.
you worried they're getting too much or not enough?
Either. It's just the purity and the concentration in these pills is highly unregulated. So we just don't know.
If they're getting not enough, that would bias towards the null here.
Right.
That would suggest if they're getting too much, I don't know what that means because I don't know what the implications are of getting.
Well, there's a bunch of adverse effects that they sought that were there to a minimal extent.
They're pretty minimal.
Yeah, they were.
What was the animal source of the melatonin? Did it say?
They didn't say. They didn't say.
Yeah.
Can I raise a couple of issues, or you want to say more about the melatonin?
Oh, and the other one was that they had a very long section on competing interests.
Go ahead.
Surprisingly long.
Surprisingly long.
I didn't read
it. And in part that some of the researchers had done work and been paid for work and speaking engagements for that manufacturing organization and some of the other medicines that they made. Now, it's easy to cast stones and say that that if you receive money for speaking engagements in something that you are an expert in, and I think that these people clearly are experts in sleep physiology, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
I agree.
But there were a surprising number of organizations and companies that made lights, that made sleep aids, that made manufactured pills and melatonin that these people had worked for and gotten compensation from, to raise kind of a question. But that's what competing interest statements are all about.
Yeah, and you could sort of say on the flip side of that, they're being totally transparent,
Right.
and some people are not totally transparent, and there's sort of at least we're getting it all out, and we can use that as information to judge a study.
And this is the best solution, I think, for that
yeah,
problem.
I agree.
Yeah, but that being said, we still have to make note of the fact that they have received money from the manufacturer of the melatonin.
Sure.
And from this actigraphy watch device, this Fitbit thing is also one of the companies that has funded them. So they're using the product and the technology for measuring the impact of the product.
I don't disagree with anything you just said, but I mean, we do studies in which we get money. We don't get money. We get donations from of drugs for the study. So our pneumonia trials will get the amoxicillin donated.
Sure, but it's a generic drug. I mean, there's no profit in amoxicillin.
No, but we're getting it for free. So there is a contribution from the maker. Is there any reason to think that that's influencing our results? We're not in the same way. I mean, I think does using the Fitbit. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm too worried about that. Mm-hmm. Anyway,
just to note.
Okay. I have two things that I wanted to raise. The first one was the sample size. So I think it's worth noting that this was a small study. 116 patients randomized. So 58 and 58, so not a large number. They benefit from the fact that they have this sort of pre-post. They have 2 observations per person, and that helps you in terms of your power, essentially controlling for a lot of things, and you're getting these 2 measurements. But still, whenever I see a study of 58 and 58, that's not enough to convince me. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I'm not disparaging. What is interesting to me, though, is they didn't actually reach the study sample size that they were powered the study on. They didn't, for cost reasons, they weren't able to recruit as many subjects as they needed. That's reasonable. But normally what happens is when you are underpowered in a study, you find significant effects. Typically, they are overestimates, not underestimates.
That's right.
In this case, the estimates were actually, if I understood correctly, smaller than what they powered it on, and yet they still found benefits. I don't know what to make of that. I don't know if it's a big deal or not, but I just pointed out something to note. What bothers me, though, a little bit is their primary outcome, Table 2, is not an analysis of every observation that they have on patients from nights on which they were in the study. They limited table 2, their primary analysis, to nights on which they actually took the melatonin, not on nights all night.
So this is the protocol
Don and I
analysis.
disagree on this.
Yeah. See, to me, they baked that in from the beginning. This was a pragmatic trial. They structured it in such a way that everybody, placebo and intervention, were told to take the pill 5 days a
That's
week.
fine.
Those nights, the day after which you had a commitment and therefore you needed to get to sleep, and leave the weekends to party. So you don't, you can stay up late and you don't need to take the melatonin at exactly the same time. So to me, it's more realistic of the real world.
I don't agree. I mean, I don't disagree entirely, but just because it's a pragmatic trial doesn't mean we don't analyze the data on those days. It's just we have a pragmatic structure. Let me just jump in here, Chris, before you get in. The reason I say this is if it was just, everybody following this protocol of 5 days on, 2 days off, that would be one thing. But they specifically say the total number of nights for which patients complied with the treatment protocol, capsule taken and bedtime instructed, did not differ between groups. Exactly the same between the groups. Then they give you the numbers, 536 versus 614 nights. I disagree that those are not different. Those are different. And if the reason why you are not taking the melatonin relates to sleep, that can bias your results. Interestingly enough, can I read the rest of this? It's 536 versus 614 nights for melatonin and placebo groups, respectively. P is greater than 0.05. Okay, so they're the same because P is greater than 0.05. Do I need to get into it, or can I just leave it there?
No, I think
that
the
is
listening
wrong.
audience knows
That is wrong. And to me, 536 versus 614 is a big difference that could lead to some confounding that you don't get if you don't do the intention to treat type approach. There are per protocol approaches that you can use that allow you to deal with only the nights when they used it, but they didn't use those approaches. They just dropped them out. And I think that's a problem. I don't know if it's a major problem, but to me it's a problem.
Yeah.
Last word to Chris.
I was struck by just how narrowly defined the final analytic sample, the cohort was. Given that they screened 3,500 and change individuals for the study, they excluded 1,826 off the bat who were deemed as low risk. Those were 821 out of the 1,826 were deemed as low risk. They don't really explain very well what that meant, but why they, half the individuals were eliminated, immediately.
Can I jump in? Why?
Yeah.
Because this not bothered me, but this raised red flags for me at first, not because there would be any bias, but it gets to generalizability.
Right.
But
exactly.
I think I actually do understand it, which is it was expensive to screen these people. Right, they had to come into a lab. They had to be, go through these expensive procedures, and so I think what they did was they ran this questionnaire first that was supposed to be a predictive of whether or not they were likely to be eligible, and so they gave that to a lot of people to get enough people who might be good candidates. So I don't think it's actually as my end conclusion was it's probably not as bad as it kind of seemed at first. Again, it's not a bias problem.
But the generalizability is a real issue because it's saying that this study really applies to a very, 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 very small subset of individuals having some sort of insomnia. One would assume because they advertised for this study in newspapers and advertisements, and so these 3,500 people who came in because they presumably have some sort of sleep disorder and are looking
I think
for
it was
relief.
an online question, but yeah.
Right, but
Yep.
when we're trying to answer the question, who is this study? Who the results of the study apply to? It does not apply to people with insomnia. It applies to this narrow subset of a particular kind of insomnia.
But I think that the authors stated that very much up front, and they focused this from the very beginning on this small subset of people who have insomnia, who have this physiologic abnormality, which is a small subset, and therefore they had to, a fair number of the people who came in and actually did get tested through this expensive process didn't have the entity, so they couldn't have been included.
Right, but I want our listeners to understand that this is not a study of insomnia. This is
It's
a
not
study
a panacea for insomnia.
Right. This is not does melatonin work for insomnia? This is not what the study question was. The question is,
yeah.
Does melatonin work for this particular, rather rare subtype of insomnia? And the question is, the answer is Apparently, yes, but the magnitude of the benefit is rather small.
But hang on, do we know for sure that it's a small subset? Do we know? I mean, I think you're going based off these exclusions.
That we go from 3,600 to 116.
But that doesn't mean none of those people who got excluded didn't have the condition. It just meant that they were sort of using this approach.
Yeah. Fair
I don't know that
they
we
could
know.
have screened out a lot of eligibles.
Yeah, I just think we don't. I think what it leads to is lack of clarity on the generalizability, but I don't think we know that it's a small subset.
The other one this is sort of a quibble more than anything, which it has to do with PLOS medicine, which has this habit of that the authors are supposed to copy edit all their own figures, and they made a mistake in their figure. I don't know if you picked this up.
I didn't.
Well, this is the one analysis where they look at the on melatonin days versus the off melatonin days, and if you look at it there, the wake up time on the off melatonin days is much later, and that's probably because that's a Saturday morning and people are sleeping late, right? That's what I would assume. And each of these is separated by 7 days because they're a week apart, except for the first one, which is 9 days off. And the time, the delay, the late wake up on that one day apparently occurs on a Tuesday, according to this.
Tuesday.
But that's because the distance between here and here is 9 days, not 7 days, and they actually mislabeled their figure.
I don't know what to say about that. But while we're on the subject, can I just get the last word here and say, I love PLOS Medicine as a journal. I hate their tables. I hate the formatting of the tables. It just looks like, I don't know what it looks like. All right, let's move on. So in our second segment, we want to talk about a paper that came out by John Ioannidis that talks about the field of nutritional epidemiology. So it's an essay. It's not a research paper. And this is a subject, nutritional epidemiology, that we've talked about many times on this podcast, and we have struggled to come to strong conclusions about any nutritional factor that was highly protective or harmful, and
we have been skeptical every single time,
and struggled with issues of systematic error in these studies.
Right.
And we know, in addition, nutritional epidemiology is something that is of great interest to the general public. Studies on nutritional epi get picked up by the media quite readily. People want to know that I can eat all the carbs I want, or I can eat all the fat I want, or I can drink all the coffee I want. And so this a lot of issues that get picked up in the media.
And fortunately, there are studies that will say that.
Despite the fact that we know there is issues of uncontrolled confounding and measurement error. So Chris, since this is a topic you love to get into, can you give us the gist of what Ioannidis' argument is on the problems with nutritional epi?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's making a rather broad indictment, not of the scientists in the field, but of the methodology of the field, which is, as we have discussed so many times, it is incredibly difficult to disentangle things. You use this phrase all the time, Matt, that risk factors party together.
They do.
I think the nutritional epidemiology is a particularly good example of that. So, there are all sorts of cultural biases associated with food. So, like when I go to my grocery store and I go and buy some artichokes, right, and I go up to the cash register, when the cash register is someone in their 40s or 50s, they bring up my artichokes. And when it's a teen, as it often is these days, they say, what is that?
Yeah.
What is that thing that you're trying to buy? They have not seen an artichoke before. And so, like, right away, that tells you that there is a bias about food. And so you would imagine that the probability of my being an artichoke consumer is confounded with my probability of being a quinoa and an arugula consumer. Right? You would think that. And it goes on and on and on. So all of these individual nutrients are in fact linked together through these intricate webs of confounding consumer choice. And so when you're studying asparagus, you're never really studying asparagus. You're studying the biology and the health outcomes of asparagus consumers, who are a different kind of people than non-asparagus consumers. And that is the basic problem. So when you superimpose that, you've got all the residual bounding and the confounding and these links, and you're never really sure what in fact you're studying. And on top of that are the inherent limitations of the epidemiologic method in terms of bias and confounding and causality. Then it becomes a real mess. And what he says here is that the field needs radical reform, because I think his bottom line takeaway from this essay is that we are in a tailspin on nutritional research where we publish and publish and publish and publish, and we never really know whether what we're saying is true or causal. And yet so often the articles are pitched to the public as if they are true and causal. And it is an overstatement on the part of the authors, making these assertions. But the consequences are not just that we're misleading consumers, but I think we're actually driving the public a bit crazy on this because nobody really knows what to believe. Like when one week it says coffee's bad and the next week it says coffee's good. And, they might actually both be true if we're measuring the risks, like coffee prevents cancer, but it promotes heart disease. For example, I have no idea if that's true. But the two of them can be washing each other out. Or it could be that neither of them is true, and they're both, we're both looking at confounding, and we just don't know.
Yep.
I went to Whole Foods the other day, right? And I was thinking about this, and I was also looking out at the parking lot to find my car, right?
Yep.
And we got back from holiday a mere 3 weeks ago, and so the kayak roof rack is still on my car. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I can see my car.
And what kind of car was it?
It's a Subaru, a bright blue Subaru. Okay, so there's another bit of confounding epidemiological information about me.
You might want to elaborate on that a little bit for our listeners from Suriname and Togo.
So this is a trendy car for suburbanite, upper middle class folks who like to buy Subaru cars.
And eat kale. And do all sorts of other things. And so I would be willing to bet a lot of money that if you did an epidemiologic study looking at the association between cardiovascular disease outcomes and kayak roof racks, that there would be a big association. And the control group could be Ford F-150 trucks.
And it is not a causal association. It is a fact that people who have kayak roof racks are of a different demographic. And this is the basic problem, is that the kayak roof rack is a symbol of 1,000 things that tell you about me. And the same thing with asparagus and artichokes.
Oh.
And you can't just analyze them in isolation. It is folly.
Okay, but to be fair, we don't just analyze them in isolation, right? We don't just simply say, I'm going to look at people with roof racks.
We do complicated regression models, and we pretend that we have controlled for these things.
Chris is getting upset. He does not like this one.
I do not like this.
No, I don't disagree with the general point. I think Ioannidis is quite onto something here, and I'll explain sort of my way of going about this paper as well. But I do want to say, I mean, we don't just we do these complex regression models because we have to do something to try and tease out. If we're going to try and tease out one nutrient, we have to do something to deal with the confounding by all of the other things that you're dealing with. And I'm not here to say that we do a good job of it. I'm not here to say that. But I think it's very different. We don't just say, let's look at roof racks and heart attacks.
No, I'm being polemical, but you took my point. But one could do that analysis.
Well, one definitely could. I don't know what one would learn other than roof racks or
nothing. You would learn nothing. That's my point.
Don?
You would learn nothing.
All right, Don. What? How did you react to this?
Yeah, the other issue I have is that we're complex biological systems, and there are. We are, human beings are, mammals are, and there are all sorts of redundancies in our system, and we are able to, in magical ways, through the wonders of physiology, take fats and make them into sugars and make them into, proteins,
and vice versa,
all over the place. And, there are certain critical vitamins, certain cofactors, which when they are deficient in your diet have really bad side effects. But when you get beyond those sorts of extreme cases, it's a very redundant and self-correcting system, so that it's really hard for me to understand how looking at one small part of this very complex redundant system is gonna really produce an experiment that will have a predictable and meaningful effect on a particular outcome of interest. So that's one thing. The other thing is that it is so incredibly compounded or made more complex by human behavior. And just the profound difficulty in changing behavior enough so that you can follow a diet of some sort, or that you can recall what your diet was from the past. Both of those things, I think, are incredibly difficult to accomplish, making any kind of empiric experimentation on nutrition as a input into a particular outcome highly complex, and I'm just very, very suspicious of it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll say more about that because we disagree on that last point. But generally, I agree with most of what you said. There's 3 points I want to make. Following up with what you just said, which is that it's so hard to remember what you ate. It's so hard to
misclassification
recall.
rampant.
We have this measurement error problem, and I think the real problem is not just that we have the measurement error problem, but we have a problem that is we don't talk enough about, which is what we call correlated error or dependent error structures. Your inability to remember certain foods, misremember certain foods, is correlated. And it's not like you just misremember one. If you misremember one, you're more likely to misremember another. And if those two things are both good for you, you're going to have these correlations in the misclassification that makes it harder and harder to remove. Now, this gets to your point, Chris, about the confounding. It gets harder to remove the confounding effects through regression if we have mismeasured the confounders, particularly if they're mismeasured in ways that are correlated with the mismeasurement in the exposure that we're interested in, that particular nutrient. And that, I think, is the problem that we pay not enough attention to, is that both we have a measurement problem, but we also have potentially a correlated measurement problem.
Matt, what did you eat for breakfast yesterday?
I believe it was a nice, healthy
Egg McMuffin.
Yeah, egg McMuffin, and an incredibly healthy shake of some kind. I don't know why.
Okay, I was just wondering. So that's what you think you had for breakfast yesterday?
I have no idea what I had.
Okay, because I was also going to ask you what you ate last week.
I couldn't tell you. I can't tell you. I can tell you probably what I had for breakfast because I actually eat probably the same thing every day.
So if you asked me, I would say it was a ham and cheese sandwich because that's what I eat every day.
Yeah.
Right? That's my breakfast. But I don't remember that.
Really?
I'm deducing that.
You eat a ham and cheese sandwich
Why
for
would you
breakfast?
eat a ham and cheese sandwich
That's
for
what I like.
breakfast?
That's lunch.
all
That's weird.
That's what I like for breakfast.
Come on, seriously?
Yeah.
All right.
What's wrong with that?
Two other points. The second one that I think Ioannidis makes, which I think is really interesting, is that he focuses this in part on the size of the effects that we're observing. So he's basically saying if you look at the size of the effects that people are finding in the literature, they're just implausible. The idea that, I think, what was the example? You eat hazelnuts. Eating a couple of hazelnuts will gain you
add 1.7 years of life.
A year of life. And it just doesn't sort of make any sense. And in some cases, they were looking at effects that outweigh the harmful effects of smoking, which just doesn't.
It's not possible.
It's not possible.
So we're coming up with estimates that are they're prima facie impossible.
Yeah.
And still we're not like saying, hey, stop. That cannot be true.
And if you in fact believe that the misclassification is that we have in food studies is non-differential, that it doesn't actually relate to the outcomes, that would suggest on average that we're underestimating effects. They should be even larger. And it just sort of starts to become a little implausible. And that's a point that I had never really thought of before. I'd certainly thought of all the issues around measurement error and confounding. And the last point is, and this is not a point that Ioannidis makes, but to me, this is the argument that we need nutritional trials.
Yes.
We need nutritional trials, which I know, Don, you disagree with. And I say that because we need trials that'll tell us not about a particular nutrient, but about whether we can nudge people to eat in a certain way for any prolonged period of time that might have an impact on their results. It doesn't mean they're going to do it, Don. It doesn't mean that trying to get you to eat in a certain way means you're going to do it, but it means if I can influence you to eat healthier and that can have an impact on your life, then we have an intervention that we can actually do.
So your outcome is to successfully convince somebody to eat a diet that you think is healthy.
No. My outcome is actually going to be the heart attack.
But do you think that you could really conduct a trial over the course of 15, 25 years?
It doesn't have to be over 15, 20 years. It can be over 5 years.
As long as the sample size is large enough.
Well, as long as...
But it may take 25 years for there to be an effect of whatever the nutritional intervention is and heart disease.
If that's true, then yes, we have a problem. But what about the trial of the Mediterranean diet? Mm-hmm. They were able to show benefits, even though not everyone adhered to it, even though it had to be retracted and republished, all those things, they were able to show benefits. And I think we need more of that. We're not going to be able to do lifelong trials because not just because we couldn't do lifelong trials, but because that doesn't lead to any practical advice for interventions. The question is, do moderately sized interventions, a 5-year intervention of trying to encourage people to eat in a certain way have benefits. It doesn't matter what they actually specifically do. It matters whether we can influence their health.
Do you mean objective physiologic benefits that where disease is either prolonged or delayed or omitted?
I do.
Because I think that a lot of what this research is about is chronic disease, and chronic disease is something that takes a long time. Even 5 years, I think, is not very long to develop certain kinds of chronic disease. Maybe obesity and diabetes, but in terms of some of the
heart
attacks or stroke or
older
mortality, I think it's really difficult.
It's certainly not easy. I'll grant you that. But in fairness, this is what we do with statin trials and aspirin trials and Coumadin trials.
Absolutely.
We're looking at a 5-year horizon with a very large cohort, but we're looking to see a biological effect of a statin drug, and we can measure that within as little as a year in some cases. So if we're achieving
different.
Well, is it different?
Yes,
we're arguing for diet as medicine. So why should we not assume that you can have the same time horizon of a clinical trial to show a clinically relevant impact of a diet? Because if it takes 15, 20 years for the diet to have any impact, then it obviously doesn't have a very big impact. We need not worry about it so much. So unless these are dietary changes that have a horizon of 5 years in terms of their impact, then who cares?
I think you have to make a distinction in terms of the mechanism. I think that when it comes to aspirin, or it comes to something that is going to change the physiology of how the body is going to react to a certain event, then that's different than changing the diet as a precursor for setting up for a disease process. I think you're right about aspirin and stroke and all the rest of that stuff, but I think looking at saturated fats over a 5-year period in terms of that outcome,
maybe heavy lift. Yeah, I got you.
All right. So we'll leave it there. We clearly disagree on this one, but I think that makes it all the more interesting. So let's move on to our last segment, which is our amazing and amusing, where we're going to highlight some of the things that make us enjoy our jobs even more than we already do. I'll look at that weird and wacky stuff that goes on. I said weird and wacky for you, Don. And as well as the things that are inspirational to us. Who wants to take it first? Chris, you want to?
These are the abusing and aphasing segment.
I have a short one.
You have a short one? I have a short one too.
Let's hear it.
I have a short one too. Go.
I can go for about an hour.
I can't.
Oh, please. Maybe I should go first.
No, I don't think so, because I can leave in the meantime. All right, so I got this off of Twitter, and I can't attribute it to anything because it was not signed. It was just something that appeared. And I want you to try to imagine, in your mind's eye, a 2x2 table. All right? The title of this is Science Articles, a Guide. It's a 2x2 table. So the first column at the top says average sentence is easy to understand. The column to the right of it is average sentence is hard to understand. Now, the rows on the left-hand side, first row says subject matter is complex. Second row says subject matter is simple. So what I'm going to do is describe the intersection between those columns and rows. So the first one is average science is easy to understand and the subject matter is complex.
Easy to understand, but complex.
Average sentence is easy to understand of the article that is describing the science. Average sentence is easy to understand and the subject matter is complex. That is great writing.
Yeah.
All right?
I agree.
Second one is average sentence is hard to understand. Subject matter is complex. That is typical writing.
Yeah,
right.
That would describe.
Third one is subject matter is simple. The average sentence is easy to understand. So subject matter is simple.
Easy.
Average. So that is honest writing.
Okay.
So then the average sentence is hard to understand, and the subject matter is simple. That is probably just.
I thought you were going to give us a relative risk and actually populate this with some numbers across different disciplines.
We could determine one, but I love that.
Good.
That is very helpful.
I like that.
We should stick that on our walls and
we really
adhere
should.
to it.
Chris, what do you got?
All right, so we're heading into the fall semester, and I'm doing my vaccine course, which is all about group work, and I'm very curious about the dynamics of group work. And these guys did a really clever experiment on the advantages of different kinds of group work versus individual work. And so the paper is called "How Intermittent Breaks in Interaction Improve Collective Intelligence," and this is again from PNAS. Lead authors Bernstein, Shore, and Lazar. Okay. And so the observation is that when people work together in groups, they often come to solutions to a common complex task more quickly than if they're working in individuals. But that interaction has a price, which is that the sophistication of the answers is often worse than the best answers that individuals working alone would come to. Meaning that as a group, you often achieve premature closure on the answer because there's groupthink, because everybody's now pulled by the first person who's the loudest person, the most influential person in the group, to come up with a plausible answer, even though that answer might not actually be the best answer. And so then the group sort of terminates and, drives to this slightly more mediocre but acceptable response, whereas the individuals lack that benefit of the interaction. But individually, if you look at the collective outputs of individuals, you actually find that they may come up with far better answers, even though on average each one of them is more likely to fail. So there's a price. And so what they said is can you study this and prove it empirically rather than this just being sort of like a general observation? And is there a way of tweaking the social interaction model so that you gain the benefits of individual work and also without the penalties of collectivism? That was the question they were asking. And so they set up this study using an experimental model called the traveling salesperson problem, the TSP, the traveling salesperson problem. And this is a video game where each individual is shown a screen with 25 cities on a map. And the task is to find your way from every single city on the map in the shortest distance possible. Okay, and it is very hard to do. So this is a task that even with 17, 20, 30 trials, people will not come up with it. And there is a perfect solution, and then there's everything that is not quite so perfect. And so the individuals in this study were randomized to 3 groups, and each group consisted of a triad of 3 individuals. One triad was allowed to work collectively, meaning that everybody in the group saw what everyone else was doing at all times and was basically sharing their information. The second group was an intermittent contact group where they did these 17 trials, and every third trial they were allowed to look at each other's work and share their work, but on the numbers 2 and 3, or the 1, 2, and numbers 1 and 2, they worked individually. And so here you're sort of harvesting hypothetically the impact of individual work and creativity, and then you bring them together and to achieve that group synergy. And then the third group was no contact at all, and they just had to work alone. And so what they found, which was really cool, was that the intermittent contact group and the no contact group were both superior to the continuous contact group in their ability to find the best solution.
Wow. So group work is bad.
The group, yes, but the full contact group outcompeted in terms of having the average best solution. And so then you do see that the average of the group tends to be better with the full contact group.
So in other words, because the individual groups some people are getting the best answer, some people are not getting even close.
Right.
So you average that together,
they get a pretty good answer.
They're not doing well. They still, if they go with the one person, they'll find the best answer.
But the groups that did the best were the intermittent groups, where they actually get the benefits of both worlds. And so I was thinking about this as how do we apply this in pedagogy with our group work? How do we get students to intermittently behave as independent units, which is basically the brainstorming part of a task solution, right? Where you say, everybody go off by yourself and see if you can solve the problem by yourself, and then we're going to come together and we're going to compare notes. And so that model is much more powerful than let's put everyone together in a group and say solve the problem, because what you get then is quick, early termination towards a mediocre solution. And I thought this was a really interesting and empirical insight into human behavior.
Regression to mediocrity.
Exactly.
Okay, so in other words,
so there's a benefit of the group, but it is not the panacea.
So from now on, we should each record our segments of the podcast alone, come back together for a few minutes, and then go back alone again? Is that what you're saying?
We can't argue against science, man.
That's pretty cool. All right. So I get the last one. Mine is very short. I got this off of Twitter, but it does speak to the problem. So I, graduate school days, had to do a thesis. Did you guys both have, in addition to your medical degrees, you both have master's degrees. Did you have to do a thesis?
No. Oh, yes, I did, actually.
Yes.
What did you do with your thesis when you were done with it?
I put it in a drawer.
Done?
Yep, me too.
No, so no one has ever read it or seen it or...
Not even my mom.
It's the age-old problem of what happens to those things,
Right.
and they go nowhere.
Right.
So this was I thought, a really nice solution to that problem. This came off of Twitter. I don't know whether I'm supposed to say the name of the person on Twitter or not, but there is a person on Twitter.
Was it our president?
No, it was not. It was a woman on Twitter who took her thesis, and she had the entire thing printed on a scarf that she can
What?
now wear.
Oh, God.
Which I think
Really?
is fantastic.
Was this a
made
PhD
me-
thesis?
I don't know if it was PhD or master's, but I just thought it was like she can now wear her thesis around, and it isn't going to sit in a drawer like every other master's thesis probably does, and so many probably PhDs too. I just thought it was a brilliant
Boy,
solution.
those are really small
really
letters.
small letters.
What I want to know
just thought it was
is
awesome.
was this an infinity scarf?
I do not know the answer to that question. All right. Well,
Is there no end?
thank you for sticking that out.
Yeah, for some theses, there is no end.
That is the end of our program. So if you've got any feedback on this or any other episode, or you want to suggest a study or a topic for us to take on, you can tweet us at @PopHealthEX, or you can tweet me at @ProfMattFox, or you can tweet Chris at @ID.Gill, or you can tweet Don at @DThea1. Or you can find us on the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthex.org. We would like to thank Leslie Talalian, Director of Lifelong Learning here at the BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for sound and editing. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you will download our next episode.
Ham and cheese for breakfast?
I know.